Hello everybody, Tyranno here, and welcome to this next episode of my series looking at interwar tanks that I think should be added to War Thunder. And today we will be taking a look at Italian tanks of the interwar period. So just a quick recap of Italy's situation after World War I. Italy had designed its Fiat 2000 heavy tank and Fiat 3000 light tanks, but neither of these tanks saw service during the conflict. Nonetheless, Italy and its Entente allies emerged from the war victorious, with Italy defeating the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, which resulted in that empire imploding at the end of the war, with many newly formed nations being formed from its remains, which meant many new members for the new League of Nations, of which Italy was one of the 4 original permanent council members, while Italy was rewarded with territorial gains in northeast Italy, as well as along the coast of the Adriatic. However, like with Japan in the last episode, many in Italy were still not particularly happy with this result, because when Italy joined the war, originally they had been promised a lot more territories on the Adriatic coast. But since then, the United States had joined the war and favoured these territories going to the newly formed nation states like Yugoslavia. This perceived betrayal, combined with the large number of Italian casualties suffered during the war, led to many Italians labelling this a mutilated victory. And within a few years, Benito Mussolini and his National Fascist Party would march on Rome and take power in 1922, becoming the first fascist state over a decade before the rise of Hitler. This would set the stage for Italy to have a much more aggressive foreign policy, with military efforts to pacify Libya being stepped up from 1922, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War breaking out in 1935, an intervention in the Spanish Civil War alongside the Germans, and the invasion of Albania in 1939. All of which would require new tanks for the Italian army, which we will be looking at today. So for the first tank we will be taking a look at the Fiat 3000B or Modello 1930, which was an upgrade to the initial Fiat 3000. As we covered in the video on Italian World War I tanks, the Fiat 3000 was an Italian version of the French Renault FT tank, being capable of a faster top speed of 13 miles per hour versus 5 miles per hour for the FT-17. However, unlike the FT tank, it was armed only with machine guns, making it unsuitable for anti-tank work. This was fixed in the Fiat 3000B, which was a newer version of the Fiat 3000, with command tanks being fitted with a new Vickers-Turney 37mm gun in the turret, which in-game has a penetration of 26mm at 500 metres with its APHE shell, more than enough to penetrate other interwar tanks' armour, and allowing it to do a good amount of post-penetration damage. Meanwhile, the original 50 horsepower petrol engine is replaced by a 63 horsepower engine, which actually reduces the range from 59 miles to 54.6 miles, and has very little effect on the top speed, with some sources saying it was improved by half a mile per hour, and some sources saying that the top speed was actually slightly reduced, so it's likely to have not much of a difference in game. Other than these changes, it still retains a maximum armour thickness of 16mm and a 2-man crew, that being the driver in the hull and the commander in the turret. I could see the Fiat 3000 being added at 0.7 to 1.0 in the light tank line just before the M1139, or perhaps folded with it, as it carries the same gun as the M1139 at 1.0, but it carries it in a rotating turret, making this far more user-friendly for newer players, though admittedly it does suffer with regards to speed, armour and the small crew complement, but it would still be a very useful tank for starting off Italian players. In real life, only 52 Fiat 3000Bs would be produced, and not all of them would be armed with the 37mm gun, but Fiat 3000s would serve in Libya, where their slow speed versus armoured cars and cavalry was a major disadvantage. But some would survive all the way until 1943, where they would be used against Allied forces during the invasion of Sicily, though by this point they were hopelessly obsolete and didn't fare particularly well against the modern Allied forces. So the Fiat 3000 was the main Italian tank until 1933, but Italy was interested in acquiring more tanks, leading to purchases from Britain, including the Vickers 6-ton and the Carden-Loyd Mark V and Mark VI tankettes. Of these, the Mark VI would be manufactured under licence in Italy under the designation CV-29, and in 1933 this would be followed by the CV-33 tankette, later redesignated the L3, which was a rather useful vehicle for the Italians to have because it was a lightweight, cheap and easy to manufacture vehicle, so could be produced in fairly large numbers. However, most of these tankettes were armed only with small caliber machine guns, so would be unsuitable for adding in game, though at least one variant with an anti-tank rifle is already in the Italian tech tree. However, there were still a few designs armed specifically with anti-tank weapons, which brings us to the Ansaldo Caro de 9T, a one-off prototype that was created in collaboration with William Foster & Co in the UK, this being the company that designed and built many British World War I tanks, from the iconic British heavy tanks to the famous Whippet tank. But this company was somewhat overshadowed in the interwar period by Vickers, who had designed the Vickers Mark I and Mark II medium tanks. To start this design, Ansaldo sent 2 engineers to Foster & Co, with a 1:10 scale model of the tank being made and presented in Italy, with construction of the full-sized prototype being done in Italy and finished by 1932, where trials showed a few problems with the prototype, resulting in a redesign of the tank, such as widening the fighting compartment so it now overhung the tracks, and later changing the suspension and tracks. Of course, one of the main advantages of this tank is the 65mm gun it carries, though unfortunately it's in a casemate so traverse is limited. Unfortunately, it's a little unclear what 65mm gun or howitzer this is, only that solid shots were to be carried, though presumably HE shells would have been available for the weapon and could be used in game, where both ammunition types would no doubt make this a deadly opponent to other interwar tanks, albeit with a low muzzle velocity making aiming harder for newer players. To round off this armament, at least 2 machine guns were carried, though there were ball mounts for 5, 1 to the left of the main gun, 2 on the right and left, and 2 at the rear of the fighting compartment, giving good all-round coverage for against soft-skin targets. Unfortunately, the exact armour thickness is not known, but presumably it would be about 15 to 20mm or perhaps a little higher, while some sloping is also used, giving some decent if not spectacular protection, while the speed maxes out at 14 miles per hour or 22.5 km an hour on the initial prototype, with the possibility of the speed being improved after the modifications were carried out, and a crew of at least 2 was carried, consisting of the driver and the commander to man the main gun, though potentially a 3rd crew member was there to man the machine guns. Overall, the Ansaldo Caro de 9T would make a decent vehicle at 1.0 to 1.3, possibly as a premium tank, with this potentially working as a tank destroyer-like vehicle, though its performance will depend on how effective its main gun is as well as its armour thickness, but it would be nice for this little-known Italian tank to be added to War Thunder. The Ansaldo Caro de 9T would be in development for a long time, with the rebuild after the 1932 tests taken till at least 1935 and possibly even 1937, by which point the design was around 8 years old, making the design itself rather obsolete, so the M1139 would be chosen instead, though some design features like the machine gun ball mounts would be carried forward for future designs. Bizarrely, the last mention of the tank was in Britain in 1940, when the design was shown to the British Tank Board, but it wasn't taken up, and after this the design was well and truly dead, never being mentioned again. So unfortunately the Caro de 9T wouldn't be adopted, but Italy still had a whole bunch of the L3s in service, with 1,337 available at the end of 1938. However, while cheap and effective against ill-equipped enemies, they did suffer when going up against well-prepared enemies. An example of this can be seen during the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, where at Dembagina on the 14th and 15th of December 1935, 8 Italian tankettes without infantry support tried to intervene during an Ethiopian ambush against a supply column, but they instead found themselves ambushed, cut off and immobilised from a lack of fuel and broken tracks, and the force was ultimately all but destroyed, with all of the tanks lost and only 4 crew escaping to friendly lines. Of course, they would still have much success during this war, but some shortcomings were identified. The next engagements that these tankettes would be put through was during the Spanish Civil War, where Italian tankettes backed up the Spanish nationalist forces, which would then face the Republicans backed by the Soviet Union, who were supplied with Soviet BT and T-26 tanks armed with the highly effective 45mm gun. Bear in mind the Italians only had machine gun armed tanks. Again, some successes could be had, but it was quickly realised that these tankettes were not going to be well suited to modern combat, especially against modern tanks. I mean, reading through my book on Italian light tanks, there is mention of a battle at Cesena, And the best it can say for the Italian tanks is that only one was lost, while not mentioning any Soviet tanks being knocked out. So work was quite quickly made to try and upgun the tankettes in Spain. This led to the Fiat CV33-35 Breeder, which I'm also going to cover in an episode looking at Spanish tanks, but essentially this was an attempt to upgun the CV33-35 with a 20mm Breeder autocannon, and some Spanish sources say they were the ones who carried out the work while Italian sources say they did the conversion, but I suspect it could still go in the Italian tech tree anyway. Ultimately, the armour and crew remained the same, but the 20mm Breeder autocannon was much more effective against armour than the old 8mm machine guns, having a penetration of 27mm at 500 metres with armour-piercing incendiary tracer shells, though the left side of the vehicle was now 200 kilograms heavier than the right, no doubt affecting mobility. In-game, if it was added to the Italian tech tree, I think it could work at 1.0, giving Italy a good alternative starting tank destroyer to the existing L333cc, which is armed with an anti-tank rifle, allowing Italian players to use a vehicle with a much faster firing weapon that will no doubt be more effective than the CC. Only one prototype was produced, and instead work was put towards installing the 20mm gun into German Panzer Is, but like I say, I'm going to cover that in an episode looking at Spanish tanks. But returning to Italy, there were efforts to design new tanks, which resulted in the creation of multiple prototypes, starting off with the Carro d'Assalto 5T Modello 1936. This unusual looking prototype had a boxy superstructure with a new turret armed with a 37-26 37mm gun. I don't have exact specs for this weapon, but it would be worse performing than the 37mm gun on the M1139, penetrating less than 20mm at 500 metres, so while better than the machine guns of the original L3s, it still wouldn't be a great anti-tank weapon. It also had a 6.5mm machine gun in a coaxial position, so can deal with soft-skin vehicles pretty well. Moving on to mobility, it seems to have a top speed of 20 mph or 32 km/h from a 42 horsepower petrol engine, and according to some sources used a torsion bar suspension, which would make this tank a very early user of this suspension type. A two-man crew was carried, and it had an armour thickness of 6 to 30mm. I suspect most of the armour is going to be on the lower end of that scale, and most of the plates are at flat angles, so I doubt this will be able to survive too much incoming fire. I could see this being added at 0.7, maybe 1.0 at a push, either as a premium or regular vehicle, as we now have a more modern tank than the Fiat 3000, while still having a turret. But the main armament is inferior, and while the tank is faster and more armoured, I suspect it would struggle against more modern enemies, though against other interwar tanks it should do decently well. The 5T Modello 1936 was tested, and presumably the Italians weren't completely happy, as they requested the design be tweaked, resulting in the Carro d'Assalto 6T Modello 1936, which was essentially a modified CV33 hull, with the same 37mm gun as on the 5T, but now installed in the hull, while two 6.5mm machine guns were installed in the turret, reminiscent to the later M1139. However, in an utterly bizarre move, the total crew count was not increased and remains at 2. So you still got your driver in the hull, and the poor commander now has to command the tank, load, aim and fire the main gun in the hull, and operate the machine gun turret, which would have left the commander overworked and in an almost impossible position to spot or respond to enemy threats. As for the rest of the stats, it again appears to have 6 to 30mm of armour, though it is at least slightly sloped this time to provide a little bit of extra protection, and it has a slightly slower top speed of around 17 mph or 28 km/h. In War Thunder, I would place this at around 0.7, as unlike the 5T, the 6T doesn't have its main armament in the turret, making its already lackluster weapon even less effective, while the top speed is slightly worse, making this just an all-around worse tank than the 5T. In real life, the 6T also wasn't adopted, but there would be one last attempt to salvage something from the design, giving us the Carro Cannone 5T Modello 1936, which is essentially the 6T but without the machine gun turret. Unfortunately, as mentioned earlier, the 37-26 was not a great weapon, so the Carro Cannone would still suffer here. But the two-man crew now makes a lot more sense, with the commander's duties being slightly reduced by the removal of the turret, The removal of the turret also reduces the height and silhouette of the vehicle, making it harder to spot and better for ambushes, while also reducing the weight of the tank back down to 5 tons, which no doubt is better for mobility. Other than this, the rest of the stats should be about the same as the 6T, so it has a top speed of 17 mph or 28 km/h, and an armour thickness of 6 to 30mm. I would probably place the Caro Cannone at 0.7, as here its weaker 37mm gun will still be able to deal with interwar and late World War I era tanks, but would likely still struggle against more modern enemies. But its slower silhouette will allow it to conceal itself more easily for ambushes, giving Italian players an edge in the lower tiers. So unfortunately, despite having a rather large tank force in the 1930s, Italy never quite succeeded in producing a decent medium tank during the interwar period, with the lackluster M1139 only just entering production in July 1939, and the more effective M1340 going into production in early 1940. And the M1139 especially would suffer during the early parts of World War II. But as you might recall, Italy had built 2 heavy tanks at the end of World War I, which came into service too late for World War I itself, but did see some limited use in Libya, though they were too slow and ponderous for this war. But one of these tanks was still around during the 1930s, so in theory Italy did have a heavier vehicle with which to base a future design on. Well, apparently someone in Italy also remembered this tank existed because they ordered it to be modernised in 1934, replacing the 2 front-mounted machine guns with 37mm guns, in addition to the existing turret-mounted 65mm howitzer and the remaining 4 machine guns, making this a ridiculously well-armed tank for the time. The rest of its stats should remain the same, meaning a maximum armour thickness of 20mm, a crew of 8 to 10, and a very slow top speed of 4.6 mph or 7.5 km/h, making this not very useful for getting around the map, though efforts to flank this tank by enemies are somewhat offset by the fact you can still cover the front of the tank with your 2 37mm guns while using the turret to deal with enemy flankers. I would suggest adding this Fiat 2000 model 1934 at 1.3. as it has a pretty good armament, an okay amount of armour for the front, and a large crew which would make destroying this tank via crew losses rather hard, though of course its slow speed lets it down. But it would be nice to see this tank in War Thunder, if only as a meme tank. In real life, this modification to the Fiat 2000 wasn't really done as a way of making it a combat effective vehicle, and was more of a propaganda effort, and unfortunately the Fiat 2000 seems to have been scrapped around the beginning of World War II. So unfortunately there's no surviving examples of the Fiat 2000 around today. Of course, in addition to the various tank designs, Italy did design some SPG type vehicles, though again these were usually not made in large numbers, usually just 1 or 2 prototypes. The first of these is the Semovente Moto Guzzi, which was supposed to be armed with a 65mm Model 1913 mountain gun, though this doesn't seem to be present in testing. But the vehicle itself is a rather interesting tank destroyer design, especially suited for use in the mountains, which was an area Italy was expecting to fight in during future wars. To this end, it had 2 independent tracks that worked in a way that whenever one track moved down or up, the other one would compensate, meaning the vehicle would remain at a flat angle even on very steep slopes, allowing the vehicle to travel across slopes of up to 45 degrees. It also has, as mentioned earlier, a rather effective main armament in the 65mm Model 1913 mountain gun, being able to fire HE and shrapnel shells, with an AP shell being designed by 1936, and early HESH and HEAT shells being developed later, though I don't think these last 2 shells should be included, as they were developed well over a decade after the vehicle was tested, but it would still function fine without these or even an AP shell if needed, especially as mentioned earlier if used against less armoured interwar tanks. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find stats on its top speed, though I can't imagine it was terribly fast, while the open nature of the fighting compartment would have made the vehicle's 2-man crew rather vulnerable, though it's possible that if put into production some sort of protection would have been added, as well as potentially increasing the crew complement. I could see this vehicle being added at 0.7 to 1.0 at a push, as it has what should be a decent gun on a rather unique chassis, but the unprotected nature of the vehicle would make it vulnerable to virtually everything, but it could still be a very fun vehicle to use in the lower tiers. In 1928 there would be another Semovente-like design in the Pavizzi Anticaro, a 5.5 tonne vehicle armed with a 57mm gun mounted at the front of the vehicle. This is probably the British 57mm gun as used on their heavy tanks, so this would have a penetration of 30mm at 450 metres, so not the worst performance by any means, but might struggle against more heavily armoured enemies. It was also fitted with 4x4 traction and steel wheels powered by a 20 horsepower engine, giving a top speed of 13.6 miles per hour or 22 kilometers an hour, while carrying a two-man crew, a driver and a commander to man the gun, while the armour is presumably going to be fairly light. I could see this being added at 0.7 as an early Semovente vehicle, as it has a decent anti-tank gun while the wheeled nature of the vehicle will make it harder to turn and face enemies, while its two-man crew will make it rather easy to knock out via crew losses. But this could still be a fun vehicle to have in game. Lastly, for SPGs, we have a vehicle that I wasn't going to cover, but could work in game as an April Fool's event vehicle, and that is the Ansaldo Moras, which is essentially a mobile shield with a top speed of 3 miles per hour and armour rated against light machine gun fire, with a single infantryman manning the vehicle. But it is armed with a 45mm Brixia mortar, which unfortunately only fires HE shells, though an AP shell was in development at some point, and so yeah, obviously this wouldn't work on the regular Italian tech tree, but it could still be a very fun vehicle to have during an April Fool's event. Then lastly, we have a few truck-based SPAA vehicles, such as the Autocannone de 2065 SU Fiat SPA-38R, which is essentially a breeder 20mm anti-aircraft cannon mounted on the back of the 38R truck. And this could be folded with the existing AS-42 at 1.3, having an advantage of having more crew, but being a larger target and having a top speed 20 miles per hour less than the AS-42. There is also at least one example of a Fiat 618 truck being armed with an 8mm Saint Etienne machine gun, which could go at a lower battle rating of 0.3 to 0.7 due to its less effective armament, but still able to provide anti-air protection for against World War I and interwar era tanks at the lower battle ratings. So that's it for this episode looking at Italian interwar tanks that I think should be added to War Thunder. I'd be interested to see your views on these vehicles and any other tanks that you'd like me to cover in the comments below. For the next episode I will likely cover either Spanish or Swedish interwar tanks, so hopefully you're looking forward to that one, and hopefully my colds that I'm sort of suffering from at the moment will have cleared up by then. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the episode, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Terreno and I'll see you next time.